A risky resignation. Armenia's prime minister steps down in order to hold snap elections. But will he return with more power? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Nikol Pashinyan. After spearheading weeks of anti-government protests, Nikol Pashinyan toppled Armenia's old prime minister and then took his spot. In the few months he's been in power, the former journalist has been on a mission. He moved quickly, removing officials he saw as corrupt, but he hasn't achieved as much as he would have liked. Standing in his way are those in parliament still loyal to the previous prime minister, Serge Sarkisian. But Pashinyan hopes to get rid of them very soon. His resignation has opened the door to snap elections, and while he's still riding on a wave of popularity, there's a good chance the old guard could be forced out. But nothing is ever certain in politics, and some think Pashinyan's decision could even backfire. Shoaib Hassan reports.
It's the latest act in the ongoing political turmoil in Armenia.
Dear compatriots, my dear people, proud citizens of the Republic of Armenia, as I said, I am resigning today from the office of Armenia's Prime Minister. The purpose of this resignation is not to leave the post of Prime Minister or the responsibility I've assumed before you, but instead to complete our non-violent velvet revolution by holding snap parliamentary elections and returning power to the people.
Pashinyan's resignation is seen as a calculated move to further consolidate political power for his My Step alliance. He was just elected in May and stepped aside despite high approval ratings. The former journalist came to power after leading a series of protests across the country. It eventually led to the resignation of the Prime Minister at the time, Serge Sarkisian. The protest broke out after Sarkisian was elected to the office. Demonstrators said the leader of the ruling Republican Party had broken a key political pledge. In 2015, he had introduced an amendment to the constitution that expanded the powers of the office of Prime Minister. It would also have allowed a former president like himself to be elected to the position. Critics, including then opposition leader Pashinyan, said Sarkisian was trying to stay in power, accusations he denied. Sarkisian did not keep his word once his term ended in 2018 and was elected Prime Minister, leading to rage on the streets. The protests only ended with his resignation and Pashinyan replacing him as head of government. But that was only after 2 votes in parliament, with the Republican Party still in the majority. Pashinyan wants to change the balance as approval for his party skyrockets. Their candidate won 81% of the vote in recent mayoral elections in the capital, Yerevan. Analysts say Pashinyan wants to capitalize on the popularity of the party to win a majority in parliament, where his rival Republican Party hinders his rule. That, as he's received support from the international community, especially neighboring Russia.
I want to wish you success as head of the government and hope that our relationship will develop as smoothly as it did before. We will continue to work actively in the international arena, in international organizations, starting with the United Nations, where Armenia and Russia have always supported one another, and in our regional organizations, in the areas of security and economic development.
So, is Pashinyan's gamble going to work? And will that bring an end to the political turmoil in Armenia? Shoaib Hassan, the newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Yerevan by Babkin Der Grigorian. He's the media liaison for Nikol Pashinyan's My Step Alliance and the Civic Contract Party. Also in Yerevan is Jiro Manoyan. He's the International Secretariat for the Opposition Socialist Party, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. And joining us from London is Lilith Gevorgian. She is the senior economist focusing on Russia and former Soviet republics at IHS Markit. Thanks all of you for joining us. Lilith, let me start with you in London. Is this the right decision, a snap election?
I think so. It's not ideal, but considering the circumstances, I think the acting Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, does not really have much choice. And there are 2 main reasons why I think that the snap elections are needed as soon as possible. Firstly, in terms of the economy, you need to remove risks such as political instability, institutional weakness, considering that Pashinyan's party has only a couple of votes in the parliament, and there is a huge need of reforms. And secondly, as long as the parties that are not necessarily representing the large electorate are sitting in the parliament, they gravitate towards them the forces that would like to see this revolution reversed.
Jiro Manoyan, are you ready?
Well, actually, no, because the position of our party is that as the government program stated, and the National Assembly adopted that program, there should be elections within a year, that is within a year of May past. So there are now electoral code changes being discussed in Parliament. Actually, today, the special session turned down in first reading those changes. We are in favor of those changes, but the majority or relative majority doesn't agree, and they just didn't participate in the vote, actually. So it didn't pass. We believe we could have still made those changes at a slower pace and eventually have them adopted and then have elections within that year. That doesn't mean necessarily next May, but not necessarily this December. December is not good in any case for election campaigning, etc.
So, Jiro, let me ask you very directly. Do you think that Pashinyan and the My Step Alliance, you think they're doing that right now because they're trying to make hay while the sun shines? They're trying to maximize the momentum that they have?
Well, actually, there is no convincing reason for that. One of the excuses given was what the previous commentator said, but that's not the only issue. Political stability is not the only issue regarding investments, economic development, etc., because there are other things going on within the economy which doesn't attract foreign investors. So there are a lot of things to be done, but why exactly this December? And I mean, that was actually made, the decision was made within the last month, I would say, because when he was in the US exactly a month ago, the Prime Minister then said he will come back to Yerevan and discuss with the political parties, political factions in Parliament on a date. But it seems he decided on his own that it should be December.
Okay, so Babkin, why exactly December? There's an element of, I guess there's blame from Jiro saying the Prime Minister's acting unilaterally here. He's not listening to Parliament, he's not listening to the people. Tell me why you disagree.
Well, I think actually it's quite the contrary, because actually from the first days of this revolution, the demand for snap parliamentary elections have been articulated very clearly from our government. And as Mr. Manoyan just mentioned, it is mentioned in our government program that we are going to have elections within 1 year. So December does fall within that 1 year. Secondly, the Yerevan elections, which happened last month, as part of that campaign, the Prime Minister very clearly articulated that this was not just about the city elections, but rather a referendum on whether we should hold snap elections as well. And our political team received 82, roughly close to 82% of the vote. And we have a clear mandate to hold snap parliamentary elections sooner rather than later. But also there's a constitutional component to this, because according to our constitution, we are supposed to have a stable majority in parliament. And as the former ruling party's members have continuously been defecting from the party, we no longer have a stable majority in parliament. With regards to the electoral code, I should say that the Venice Commission themselves just recently gave a mostly positive outlook on the electoral code. And even Mr. Minoyan's party voted in favor, so I welcome that vote, and also mentioned that they are ready for the elections, for the December elections. So really, there's political and constitutional reasons for going to elections sooner rather than later.
Okay, so Jiro, to honor the wishes of those people who took to the streets and wanted change. Isn't this taking the Velvet Revolution to its rightful democratic conclusion by holding a democratic election, no more, no less?
I don't think it would have had another result, or it would not have really taken the Velvet Revolution to the next step if it were the elections were held in March, for example, with the electoral code changed. Now, the electoral code, as of today, is not changing. That's not necessarily the government's. The government is not to blame for that because they don't have the vote in parliament, the votes in parliament, but rushing it might have created an atmosphere where the relative majority party decided actually not to participate and in that way not to have the new electoral code adopted. This is crucial for the government's program as well. Otherwise, the elections could have been held last June or July or August. We didn't have to wait until December if the electoral code is not to change.
Right.
The aim was to change the electoral code and go to elections with the new electoral code.
Okay, so two fundamental differences there of opinion on the electoral code and what these elections will mean in December. Let me allow this conversation to take a bit of a turn here, Lilith, and I want to talk Russia. And I'm going to ask you about Russia through the prism of Robert Kocharyan and Mr. Putin giving him a call a couple months ago, I think. How important is the current zeitgeist vis-a-vis Russia, and what does this mean for Armenia? Is it going to be turning away from Russia, and what are we going to see happen with Kocharyan?
Well, there are two different questions here. When it comes to the revolution or the revolutionary leaders, they set out from the onset of this revolution that foreign policy is not one of the issues that the revolution is happening about. This was exclusively inward-looking process, and the now acting Prime Minister Pashinyan made it very clear that the foreign policy vis-à-vis Russia, or indeed the foreign policy that the previous government had, is not going to change. Now, that is the Armenian perspective. When it comes to Russia, any movement that has democratic origins in essence is problematic for Russia, because it brings uncertainty, because it brings in leaders who are less controllable. So in the long term, I would argue that Russia is not interested to see these sort of changes or strong democratic institutions developing in Armenia. From Russian perspective, of course, the former ruling party and the so-called opposition parties, or quasi-opposition parties, that were basically part of the system and very much pro-Russian, would have been a better choice. However, Russia is facing a dilemma. The fact that the revolution happened, and despite having such a vast network of people in Armenia on the ground, they failed to see that this is happening. And the fact that all those former elite parties or political parties in effect are not really supported by the public, so there is not much political capital to work with, is a problem for Russia. Despite the overtures towards Kocharyan, who actively sought those pronunciations of support from Moscow, Russia is also aware that at this stage they won't be able to organize themselves or organize truly loyal political forces on the ground to bring down Pashinyan's revolutionary forces. However, I do not exclude this in the long term. Having said that, I think what Kocharyan is doing is quite questionable in terms of his political career. I don't think he has any political career, and I think his motivation is not even political. I think he's more concerned about what's going to happen to him, his family, and all those suggested speculations about potential investigations into his assets.
Yeah, he's at large as far as I know, and there are charges against him. Babkin, how do you feel? The Russians are not so sure about the revolution, probably didn't like it, probably prefer your predecessors. They don't like color revolutions in the region or in their sphere of influence. Are they going to try to undermine you, whether you do well in these elections or not?
Well, first of all, I want to say that this wasn't a color revolution in the pejorative sense that
right.
That term has gotten. But look, Russia remains our strategic partner. We intend to and have been working very actively with them, and we intend to expand our cooperation and our partnership with Russia moving forward, of course, without it being at the expense of any of our other partnerships. So I don't see a Russia factor here at all. And I think many people who try to provide analysis on the region very quickly turn to the Russia factor. In this case, this is very much an internal process.
Right. So, Jiro, for those people who see a democratic atmosphere and a general trend towards wanting more representative democracy in the country, and they see that as meaning that Armenia will turn towards the West, are they right or wrong?
I don't know, I think they're wrong, because as Pashinyan himself has said thousands of times, that this is an issue, an internal issue, as Babkin was saying, that the aim is to democratize Armenia and not change the external relations or the vector of the external relations of the country. Saying that, I think all of us in the country, at least our party, I can speak on behalf of our party, do not wish for any foreign intervention by any foreign country that may be, because this is an internal affair. We have to give the Pashinyan government or Pashinyan team the popular will. We have to give them a chance to establish the more strongly democracy in Armenia, and without making any excuses for intervention. As I said, there is no issue, nor in the government plan, neither in the government plan nor in the now acting Prime Minister's statements, position, that there will be any change of vector. So the old times, so to speak, are gone. Everybody should accept that. They cannot be brought back, and that's good that they won't be brought back. But that doesn't mean Armenia, a democratic Armenia, cannot have good strategic relations with Russia. I think there is no aim, unlike others in the region, there is no aim in Armenia either to export our Velvet Revolution. So nobody should be worried about that as well.
Right. And
I think the big important for us is for this to succeed, meaning the process to come to a successful conclusion, and for the people to feel that they can decide on their fate.
Right. I know you disagree with how soon the elections are coming, but having said that, when they do come, is this an exciting time politically for your country, Mr. Manoyan? Is it a time for young people to finally have a proper democratic voice?
Of course, and I think the acting Prime Minister wishes to change the atmosphere to a more positive one as compared to the Yerevan municipal elections that we had about a month ago, so that those elections will be, I mean, the upcoming elections will be about ideas, etc. I don't think it will be, again, a referendum on anything. The Prime Minister was making announcements that he wishes that these elections will give the people a chance to elect between programs, policies, and not necessarily just individuals, so that the people themselves can decide, as I said, on their future.
Okay, well, you're just next door, and we'll be watching the build-up to those elections and the elections themselves very closely from here in Istanbul. For the moment, I have to move on, but I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Babken Der Grigorian, Jiro Manoyan, and Lilith Gevorgian. Thanks again. Still to come on the program, it's 1 year since Marawi was declared free from terrorists. But could Daesh return to the Philippines? And it's now illegal in Hungary to sleep on the streets. But is a ban on rough sleeping really the way to reduce homelessness? 1 year ago, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte declared the city of Marawi free from terror. It was announced as the fighting between the army and Daesh-linked militants drew to a close. The siege lasted 5 months and forced hundreds of thousands of people out of the city. Once the guns fell silent, the work of reconstruction began. But things haven't been moving as fast as many have hoped. The area is still under martial law and there's a heavy military presence. Poverty is everywhere and access to education is hard to come by. Many in the city are deeply frustrated. And with Daesh recruiters still known to be operating in the area, there's fear disaffected people could fall prey to the terror group. For more, here's Randolph Nogel.
It's impossible to know how many bullets were fired during the siege of Marawi. But the damage suggests anyone who was holed up here and survived did so within an inch of their life. The Daesh supporters who took control of the city for 5 months last year are gone. But the people who call this place home can only sift through what remains of their belongings and wait for a new Marawi to be built in its stead.
Sana magkaroon kami ng bahay ulit. Mabigyan kami ng puhunan, anak buhay kasi yung mga anak ko na nag-aaral ngayon na hindi na sila nakapag-aral kasi wala na kaming anak buhay, wala na kaming bahay, lahat wala.
Tens of thousands of people today still live in camps. The government says help is on the way.
We are working, government is doing its best to restore as much as possible what was destroyed, and I think we are on the road. But we'd like to call on all those who had gone through suffering to please be patient. There is no magic formula here. There is no reconstruction that will happen overnight.
A $1 billion reconstruction project is set to be launched, and Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte is expected to soon visit Marawi to inaugurate the reconstruction projects. But some people from the ethnic Maranaos, a Muslim group that forms the local majority, have complained that they've not been adequately consulted. Duterte's government has contracted a Chinese firm for the rebuild. And in this impoverished region, many of those who suffered great loss during the Marawi campaign feel that they should be given the opportunity to rebuild their own city. Marawi is but one chapter in a centuries-long saga of rebellion in Mindanao, the Philippines' second-largest island. Rebel groups like the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the Moro National Liberation Front have fought for autonomy in Mindanao for generations. They're not allied with Daesh, but some of their fighters have been recruited and have crossed over to join Daesh-linked or inspired groups. Earlier this year, the Philippines Defense Secretary ordered troops to prepare for a possible repeat of the Marawi siege in another city. Delphine Lorenzana said there's a continuing rebellion, an argument that resonated with the Supreme Court, which extended martial law in Mindanao until the end of the year. The continuation of martial law has provoked public anger. But Duterte's biggest legislative achievement to date, the Bangsamoro Basic Law, which provides for greater autonomy in Mindanao, has renewed hope for a lasting peace.
May this serve as the final trajectory for the attainment of genuine peace, stability, good governance in Muslim Mindanao.
The two main rebel groups are working with the government to prevent Daesh from gaining a permanent foothold in Mindanao. Some Daesh-linked fighters are believed to be targeting rebels to fracture solidarity and encourage more dissenters. Daesh recruitment could also be affected by whether martial law is renewed at the end of this year and how fast homes are rebuilt in Marawi. For now, Mindanao appears to be at a crossroads. Duterte and his government will have to walk a fine line between providing security and expanding autonomy, so that this volatile, underdeveloped region doesn't take a turn for the worse. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Let's bring in our panel now. Jose Custodio is in Hong Kong. He's a military historian and senior fellow at the Institute for Policy Strategy and Development Studies. Stephen Cutler is in Manila. He's a security analyst and a former chief of FBI operations in the Philippines. And completing our panel also in Manila is Amina Rasul. She's the president of the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Jose, let me start with you. 1 year on, when we look at Marawi, did the Philippine state win the war, but are they perhaps losing the peace?
I think that as of now, we can still say that the government still has the window of opportunity to do things right. Okay, so far the Maute has been having difficulty in trying to recruit. Okay, it's actually on the run because it exhausted itself in last year's battle. Okay, so there are remnants. Okay, but they cannot be discounted. Okay, because even though, as I said, that there is a window of opportunity for the government, there still remains. Okay, for them to do things right, but that will be steadily decreasing as time passes. Okay, so because there's already existing complaints already from residents in Marawi, and especially the displaced people. So that can eventually may cause some form of resistance against the government.
Stephen Cutler, what did we learn from those 5 months of fighting last year?
Well, one of the things that I think that we learned is that there are many, many facets to the problem in Marawi. There was drugs involved, there's corruption. There are all sorts of issues that really complicate the battle that we had over the last year. And I include the entire year because trying to resettle that many people and rebuild the manufacture of drugs, the corruption, and all the different facets, that's far beyond merely the army fighting. That said, the intelligence, understanding of the terrain, who they were actually fighting against, was sadly lacking. And I think that that's a serious issue that the government needs to deal with as well. You know, Sun Tzu 2,500 years ago told us, know your enemy, know yourself. And they seem to have missed knowing their enemy.
Stephen, what didn't they know about their enemy? Where did they get it wrong?
Well, I think one of the things that they didn't know was the ability of these people to move about in an urban environment and basically own what I call own the terrain. They didn't realize the extent that these people held actual ground within an urban environment. It's one thing to own some territory that you're not comfortable in operating in, such as jungles and mountains and so on, but in an urban terrain, you expect the government to actually know what's going on, have a good sense of what the people are doing and who's doing what with whom. And that seems to have been, again, I say seems to have been lacking.
Amina Rasul, when we look at the death toll, more than 1,000 killed, yes, a lot of Daesh and Maute militants or even suspected militants, a lot of civilians, 168 soldiers and policemen were killed. Extraordinary cost. When we look at some of these images as well of Marawi, it's horrendous. It's almost post-apocalyptic, right? When we see the results 1 year on, are you happy with the results? Are you happy that the place is now in a position to be rebuilt?
Well, we're not ecstatic. Nobody's happy, not even government, about the delay in the start of the rehabilitation of Marawi. But before I go on with that, let me just say something about the analysis of of the fighting. It's what is true that everything was complicated by these interlocking issues of drug trade, which fed part of this extremist group, and the political activities going on, corruption. But really, the siege of Marawi, many of us believe that it could have been avoided. And that one of the basic problems was maybe miscommunications within the top echelons of the national decision-making process. We truly believe that if those who had the hand in developing the strategy were old hands in Mindanao, like Defense Secretary Lorenzana, then perhaps a different strategy would have emerged. Instead, you had this protracted urban warfare, which did not need to happen. Now, having said my piece about that, the rehabilitation of Marawi, it's been 1 year and 5 months since the start of the siege. It's been a year since the liberation of Marawi. There have been some major problems in the start of the rehab, one of which is the failure of the original consortium organized by some Chinese companies in getting the go signal to start with the rehabilitation project. So now they had to basically start from scratch.
Right.
What worries me is the situation within the camps. If you are talking about recruitment for extremist group, for ISIS, you target those who have been disenfranchised. You target those in the camps. And if I were to develop the strategy for Marawi, I would not wait for the reconstruction of the city. I would concentrate on the rehabilitation of the people who are in the camps. I have been to the camps many times. We are organizing projects there, and it is miserable.
Right.
If I were to recruit for ISIS, this is ready-made for me.
But it's interesting, right? Because then you have the Chinese, for example, who gave $60 million, the US giving, the US giving $60 million, the Chinese giving $20 million. It's far easier to rebuild a road than to rebuild hearts and minds, right? You're going to take that money and you're going to try and rebuild the city. So this is a tough ask and a tough challenge. Jose, you've been there recently, and we're going to look at some of your photographs that you took. Yes. Thankfully, thank you for giving us permission to run them. When I look at some of your pictures, and I look at some of the pictures from other people, Mother Jones and other agencies have been there, it looks very similar to Mosul after Daesh was kicked out of there and destroyed, that they lost their stranglehold of the place. Does the place look, seem, and feel uninhabitable, Jose? Is it a place where people cannot live at this moment in time?
For starters, okay, nobody can stay there for one simple reason. I don't think the military has cleared the area of unexploded ordnance, okay? There apparently are a lot of unexploded ordnance there because the place was heavily shelled and heavily bombed, okay? And several large 500-pound bombs still remain, I think, unrecovered. Okay, and we haven't even talked about the artillery shells that have been duds. Okay, that are still there, or the mortar rounds that have failed to explode. See, the thing is that when we talk about rehabilitation, okay, it's easy to rehabilitate a town that has been destroyed by a typhoon, right? But you can't rehabilitate, you can't build, even if the Chinese consortium was allowed to proceed with its programs, it cannot do anything unless the area is cleared of explosives, okay, or unexploded. And by that, on that very score alone, that area is cordoned off because of the fear of some undiscovered bombs or shells. Okay, so that thing alone could delay further any rehabilitation. Okay, so you already have problems in the rehabilitation of the city in terms of awarding bids, contracts. Then there's also the land issue problem there, that people who there's a fear that you can have land grabbing in that city. Okay, as developers come in and then redraw everything, and at the same so with that problem is now you have this other problem of unexploded ordnance. So what are we going to do about that? Okay, so you can't have a rehabilitation going. I mean, you can have reconstruction if you don't have those things.
Right.
So I'm not so sure if the government has already cleared that entire area. I doubt, actually.
Yeah. Stephen Cutler, let's
So
talk.
a lot needs to be done. So,
certainly, Jose. Certainly,
so
Jose.
then we...
Right. Okay.
Yes.
And fair point. So, Stephen Cutler, let's talk about this kind of devil's cocktail of the local grievances, maybe that's the Maute element, mixed with a global caliphate agenda of ISIS or Daesh. Those two come together, it creates something ugly, and the government has to take it on. When you spoke earlier on about the government underestimating or misunderstanding who they were fighting, is there also an argument to be made that moving forward, they don't quite know how to fight this duality of both the sort of global ISIS element and the local grievances? How do you solve that? How do you tackle that?
Well, that's an incredibly difficult issue, and it's actually one of the things that as the United States and the EU move forward, I think there are many, many lessons that can be learned from the Philippine context, almost a living laboratory, if you will, for the future. Because one of the things that we've got to worry about is, in the old days, there was a hierarchical command structure, if you will. You had Osama bin Laden, who was in charge, who had to kind of sign off on some things and different projects going forward, funding going forward, and so on. In these days, though, ISIS can claim that they've got these groups in southern Philippines, northern Philippines, in Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. And those groups can claim to be part of global ISIS. And in fact, they've never really talked to each other. There is no funding going back and forth, or very little funding going back and forth that we can trace through the traditional, what we'll call counterterrorism financing investigations. And so it's really, really difficult to break these things up. It's going to take some very strong thinking on the part of intelligence community, whether that's law enforcement, military. I would also suggest the academic world in social media and psychology, criminology, and other such groups to really think about how we can use a whole of government approach to try to stop this.
Right.
It's going to take some research into what used to be called lone wolf, but now has gone into small groups, cells.
Right.
How do we break those up? How do we identify them? How do we find them? For example, the suicide bombing family in Indonesia a few weeks ago. Well, how do we identify those people? Oh my gosh.
Yep.
It's very, very difficult. How do we get into their psychology?
Certainly. Amina Rasul, Mindanao is still under martial law. Is it justified?
Well, things have improved in Marawi, certainly. So I think even the Marawi residents welcome martial law. But how long do you extend it? Is it going to have other ramifications, other impact, negative impact? What worries me about the situation in Marawi, all of this anxiety, all of this unhappiness is taking place as the government is preparing to assist in the plebiscite, creating a new region. Now, if you care to look at some data, I would point you to the Social Weather Station's SWS website. We did a survey of 3 conflict-affected areas last April. Marawi, Lanao del Sur, which is the province where Marawi is, and Maguindanao. And we asked questions of the respondents, trying to determine their appreciation of what government is doing. And let me tell you that the unhappiness level is rising. And this will have impact on the success of the plebiscite, especially in Marawi. In the plebiscite, what we want is for the present region of autonomy, the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, to expand, to include more areas. What we don't want is for members of the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao breaking away, saying no, they don't want to be part of this new region because of the anxiety that's happening in Marawi.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. And give me that website again, Amina, just for our viewers' sake.
It's the Social Weather Stations, SWS, the leading polling station of my country.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, for people who want to get a pulse of what people think in the region. Good to talk to all of you. It's been a pleasure. Amina Rasul, Stephen Cutler, and Jose Custodio. All the best. Hope to have you on the program again.
I think those who made this law have no idea what it is like to live on the street.
The Hungarian government and its right-wing Prime Minister Viktor Orban is known for railing against the EU and asylum seekers. Now they have a new target, the homeless. A new law has come into effect that outlaws sleeping on the streets. The government argues the ban will actually save lives by forcing people off the streets and into state institutions. But critics say fining rough sleepers is cruel and impractical. And according to some experts, there are only half the number of places needed in state-run shelters to house all of Hungary's homeless. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Budapest by Tessa Udvarhelyi. She's an activist with the group The City is for All, which works for housing rights and aims to empower the homeless. And in San Antonio, Texas, is Robert Marbut. He's worked on addressing homelessness for more than 3 decades and is a principal consultant at Marbut Consulting. I thank you both for joining us. Tessa, the government has a rationale behind this. They say they're going to save lives. They say they're going to eliminate homelessness and panhandling, and they're going to make the streets safer. Do you accept that at all? Even if you disagree, do you accept that they have good intentions?
It's really difficult to imagine that they have good intentions. If you want to put an end to homelessness, you actually have to provide housing for people, and not only homeless people, but everyone who lacks affordable, safe and healthy housing. And today the Hungarian government is not doing that. The only thing that the Hungarian government is doing is criminalize homelessness. Otherwise, there are no measures at all to support housing for the poor.
So, Robert, is that what it is? Criminalizing homelessness, no more, no less?
I think it is, and like your other guests suggested, it doesn't work. At a fundamental level, it becomes a gimmick that makes the politicians feel good for 8, 9, 10 hours. But in the end, you overcrowd your jails, you overcrowd your criminal justice system, and the individuals end up going back on the street, and you've done nothing to address the root causes of homelessness or rough sleeping.
So, Tessa, if they actually had the spaces available in shelters and government-run institutions and they treated people properly there and it was decent, would you be more sympathetic to their drive to getting people off the streets?
No, because we think that homeless shelters are not the solution to homelessness. Homeless shelters are basically just emergency solutions. And right now, what they do is warehouse people. So they are just keeping people off the streets without offering any kind of alternative or exit out of the system. So what we are saying is that the government should introduce measures that prevent homelessness, for example, by preventing families from becoming homeless, from preventing children being taken away from their families because they become homeless. And the government needs to provide housing support for people who live in rental housing or even in private homes. Right now, all the government in Hungary is doing is supporting the housing of rich people, basically, or at least the middle class, but they are not doing anything to prevent people from becoming homeless or to help homeless people leave the homeless shelter system. They are basically just circulating in the system, going from one shelter to the other or going from the street to another shelter, but they are not really leaving. They don't have a chance to leave the system.
And Tessa, the fact that they actually changed the constitution in order to do this, and looking at some of the language that they've used for the homeless, does that worry you?
To be honest, it has worried us for 8 years now. So when this government came into power in 2010, one of their first measures was to introduce a very similar law to today's law. which then developed into a more, I would say, complex set of laws, which then the Constitutional Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to criminalize homelessness. And actually, the criminalization of homelessness got into the Hungarian constitution in 2012, exactly because the government didn't want, so they put it into the constitution so that it can't be ruled unconstitutional. So actually this kind of law has been in effect for many years, and this is just the latest variation, and I would say the most cruel variation of the same law.
And do you believe, Tessa, that it's a continuation of, as some people see it, the rhetoric against immigrants, the rhetoric against outsiders, the homeless folded into this?
Yes, I agree. I think it's part of this enemy-making process that the government is using to keep its power. So over the past 8 years, they have created enemies out of homeless people, refugees, migrants, Roma people, poor people, even people with disabilities. They always need someone to fight against. And I think they have kind of run out of enemies. So now they are returning back to an old enemy of theirs, which is homeless people, because this cycle of criminalization already took place in 2011 to 2012. And then came the refugees, and then also NGOs became a big enemy of the government. So I think they are using homeless people as a tool of political manipulation to create political power and to create an anti-homeless and anti-other atmosphere.
Right. So, Robert, if a member of the Hungarian government was watching this and they thought, well, okay, maybe we've got this wrong, and they called you up and said, you've got decades of experience here, we're going to fly you into Budapest, tell us what to do. We've got 30,000 people out on the streets. How can we do this better? What would you say they need to do?
Well, first is you got to realize criminalization won't work, and that's a gimmick, and that will just give you a short-term boost, maybe 8, 9, 10 hours, and it won't work in the long run. What we know that works is working on the root causes of homelessness, working on mental health, substance abuse, and post-traumatic stress. That's really where you need to focus. And if you focus in that area, the housing starts to fix itself because you have now the finances available to start doing market rate housing. But if you don't work on the root causes, you're never going to get a reduction in homelessness.
Okay, so you work on the root causes, but in the immediate present, there are these people on the streets. Where do they go?
Well, that's why the criminalization doesn't work. You can criminalize all you want, and nobody will have any place to go. So it will not work what the movement they're moving toward. It only works if you have enough both real housing and interim short-term shelter. And you don't want to do shelter in the long run, but short-term sheltering is a good entry into long-term housing. But you have to have enough of that for it. So if there are 20 to 30,000 individuals on the street, if you only have 11,000 beds, that's not going to work. You're set up for failure already.
Yeah. So Tessa, I'm looking at some of the instruments in the government toolbox here when it comes to the homeless, and if you refuse to leave the streets. So as far as I understand, the authorities can impose fines. They can give prison sentences as well, or mandatory participation in public works programs. This has just come into effect. From what you understand, Tessa, has it been happening? Have people been fined or been sent to prison so far?
Yeah, actually, in this new version of the law, there is no fines. So you can either get a warning from the court, you can be forced into public work, or you can go to prison. So these are the three options that any court has if somebody is charged with habitual residence in public space or homelessness. And yes, the police started enforcing this law on the day that it came into effect, on October 15th, so on Monday. And there have already been 4 cases that we know of. 4 homeless people have already been brought in front of the court. And so far, 3 of them have received only warnings. And in the case of the 4th person, his physical health was not good enough for the court, so they postponed the actual procedure.
And Tessa, the United Nations and the European Union have both been critical of the law, especially as it hit the point of implementation. Does Viktor Orban care, or do you think that they might actually recalibrate and do something if there's external pressure?
That's very difficult to tell with our government. On the outside, they always resist external pressure, and then we never know what's happening in the background. In the case of the European Union, it has happened often that their public rhetoric was really aggressive and strong against the European Union, but in the background, they actually did a lot of small adjustments to the, the expectations of the European Union. I think in the case of homeless people, it's simply just not. I think outside pressure is not the key. I think Hungarians need to step up against this, and it's actually happening. So people are showing much more solidarity than before, and I think it has, in this sense, a good impact on Hungarian society because it's actually something that we discuss now, and a lot of people are showing solidarity and they want to help homeless people and they want to oppose legislation like this.
Okay, and Robert, very finally for you, I want to sort of cast a global net here. I've lived in many cities in many countries around the world. Each of those cities has a very different approach to homelessness, from cities such as San Francisco on the one hand to, say, Johannesburg, South Africa on the other. Given your knowledge, is there anywhere that they're doing it right, or they have done it right, where they had a major problem of homelessness and they found a way to make it go away without harming the homeless?
And the answer is yes. The area called Pinellas County, which is the western jurisdiction of Tampa, has done a very great job. Here in San Antonio, we've done a very good job. And the key is if you focus on recovery and rehabilitation, rather than either the symptoms on one extreme or the other extreme, criminalization, if you work in the middle, you can really make it work.
Okay, Robert Marbut and Tessa Udvar-Helge, it's been good to talk Hungary and homelessness with you. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Turkish authorities reveal their findings after Saudi Arabia admits Jamal Khashoggi was killed in their consulate. How will the world react? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.